She publicly humiliated him for being a veteran, assuming he had nothing to offer, until he stood up, shared one real story, and turned the entire class against her. Ethan Carter never liked to talk much about his time overseas. At only 19, he had already lived through things most of his classmates at Lakewood Community College couldn't begin to imagine. After serving as a specialist in the U.S. Army for nearly 3 years, he'd returned home determined to move forward. For him, that meant enrolling in college and chasing a quiet dream, becoming a journalist. He wasn't the loud type. He didn't walk around with medals or wear a uniform that would announce what he'd been through. You wouldn't even know he was a veteran unless you asked. Most people didn't. He kept to himself, showed up on time, and sat in the middle row of his classes, close enough to hear, far enough not to be noticed. Ethan had enrolled in Introduction to American Literature, mostly because it was required, not because he loved fiction, but something about storytelling, especially when it revealed something true about people, their fears, their pain, their quiet strength had started to interest him. Maybe it was because of what he saw during his deployment. Maybe he just wanted to understand the world better than he did before. It was the first Monday of the semester, and the classroom buzzed with the usual start of term energy. New students flipping through syllabi, others checking their phones, the occasional awkward attempt at conversation. When Professor Margaret Vaughan walked in, the room quieted almost immediately. She looked exactly like the kind of professor you'd see in a film, tweed blazer, wire-rimmed glasses, and a tone that suggested she didn't suffer fools. She introduced herself quickly, almost coldly. No smile, no small talk, just straight into her expectations: punctuality, participation, and intellectual rigor. Her voice was sharp, with just enough edge to make some students sit up a little straighter. When she called roll, she paused at Ethan's name. Carter. Ethan Carter. "You're the veteran, right?" she said, not bothering to look up from her clipboard. He nodded once. "Yes, ma'am." Her lips curled slightly, not quite a smile. "Well, let's hope you remember how to write essays, not just field reports." A few students chuckled nervously. Ethan didn't say a word. For the rest of that class, she barely looked his way. But something in the air had shifted. It was subtle but unmistakable. That offhand remark, while quick, stuck to him not because he was offended. He'd heard worse, but because it was unnecessary. She didn't know him. She hadn't read a single word he'd written. And yet, she had already decided what box to put him in. That first week, Ethan did what he always did. He paid attention, took notes, submitted his first assignment on time. It was a thoughtful reflection on a short story about post-war trauma. He didn't mention his own experiences, but his insight was clear. Still, when he got the paper back, it had more red ink than he expected. The grade, a flat C, no comments. "Just needs depth," scrawled at the top. He took it quietly, but his mind stayed busy. Was it his writing? Or was there something else going on? He didn't jump to conclusions. He was trained to observe, not react. But as the days went on, small things added up. Every time he raised his hand, she'd cut him off mid-sentence. When he referenced anything military-related, she'd roll her eyes or redirect the discussion. It wasn't open hostility. It was more subtle than that. Controlled, calculated, the kind of dismissiveness that only someone in a position of authority could wield so effortlessly. Still, Ethan remained patient. He had been through far worse in more dangerous places. But the difference now was this. Here, people were watching. They saw it happening. And nobody said a thing. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that a storm was building. And before long, Ethan would be the one to turn that quiet storm into something no one in that classroom would forget. Not because he was loud, not because he lost his temper, but because when you strip away the uniform, the silence, and the assumptions, what's left is a man who knows the truth and isn't afraid to speak it when the moment finally comes. By the second week of class, the tension between Ethan and Professor Vaughan had become hard to ignore, at least for those who were paying attention. At first, it was the way she skipped over him when calling on students, even when his hand was clearly raised. Then, it was her subtle but biting commentary whenever he did manage to speak. On the surface, it all seemed like a professor keeping control of her class. But if you listened closely, there was something else at play. It was Wednesday afternoon. The topic of discussion was The Things They Carried by Tim O'Brien, a story about Vietnam War soldiers carrying not just weapons but emotional burdens. Vaughn stood at the front of the class, gesturing with a marker in one hand and the novel in the other. "This is fiction," she said sharply, circling a line on the whiteboard. "It's not a diary. It's meant to explore metaphor, not validate any one soldier's version of reality." Then she turned, almost as an afterthought. "Mr. Carter, I'm sure you have some first-hand perspective you'd like to add." There was no real invitation in her tone. It was more of a challenge, a spotlight she flicked on and off when it suited her. Ethan straightened in his seat. "I think the emotional side of this story is real, regardless of whether the events actually happened. A lot of guys I served with, they carry more now than they ever did out there." A few students nodded, but Vaughn didn't. She smiled faintly, tight-lipped, and said, "Yes, well, this isn't group therapy. We're analyzing literature, not reliving military nostalgia." That one hit differently. The room fell quiet. Someone in the back shifted uncomfortably in their seat. Ethan didn't flinch. He kept his eyes on the board, wrote something down in his notebook, and said nothing. But he noticed. He noticed the way her tone changed when she addressed him versus the other students, how she made subtle jokes about discipline and obedience when assigning reading. Once, when he missed a word during class discussion, she quipped, "Too many drills, not enough dictionaries." It was always said with a smile, but not a kind one. By week 3, it was no longer just Ethan who noticed. His classmate, Liam, who sat 2 seats over, leaned in during a break and whispered, "What's her problem with you?" He shook his head. "I don't think she has one." Liam gave him a look that said he didn't buy it. "Well, if she talks to me like that, I'm filing a complaint." Ethan appreciated the support, but he wasn't wired that way. He was used to being underestimated. It didn't bother him so much until it did. The final sign came the following Monday. Professor Vaughn had assigned each student a short essay connecting a personal experience to a theme in the story. Ethan spent 2 nights working on his. He wrote about fear, not the battlefield kind, but the quiet kind that creeps in during the stillness after the noise stops. He didn't mention exact missions or details, just the weight of it all. He printed it, stapled it, and submitted it on time, like everyone else. When she returned the essays, Ethan's was again marked with a red C. This time, she'd written 2 words at the top, "too personal." He read those words 3 times, "too personal." That had been the assignment. Everyone else had written about breakups, losing a grandparent, a childhood trauma. But for some reason, his story was too personal. It wasn't about grades anymore. It was about respect or the absence of it. After class, he waited until most students had left. He approached Vaughn's desk calmly. "Can I ask what you meant by too personal?" I was under the impression that the prompt encouraged reflection. She didn't look up as she packed her briefcase. It did. But some experiences come with baggage. They make objective analysis difficult. Maybe next time, pick something less emotionally charged. "I thought that was the point," he replied, still calm. She closed her briefcase with a snap. "Ethan, this is an academic environment, not a military base. You'd do well to learn the difference." And with that, she walked out of the room. He stood there for a moment, alone, not angry, not embarrassed, just certain now. This wasn't about literature. It wasn't about academic standards. This was personal. And sooner or later, that line she kept crossing, he'd respond, not with rage, not with threats, but with something that would make her, and everyone else, remember his name for all the right reasons. By the 4th week, Ethan's quiet patience had become a point of quiet admiration among his peers. He wasn't confrontational, and he never raised his voice, but those who sat near him, who read over his shoulder or watched the way he engaged during class, could tell he knew what he was doing. His work was thoughtful, his observations cut deep, his essays were clean, deliberate, and grounded in real experience. But none of that seemed to matter to Professor Vaughn. She had started targeting him in new ways, more public, more deliberate. During a discussion on postmodernism, Vaughn was emphasizing the idea that truth is subjective. She posed a question to the class. Can anyone give an example of a time when truth was manipulated for the sake of narrative? Ethan raised his hand. She paused, sighed noticeably, then called on someone else. After a beat, she finally looked his way. "Fine, Mr. Carter." He spoke clearly. "There was a mission we went on where the press release left out key details. They reported a clean operation, but in reality, civilians were injured. The report fit the narrative, not the facts." The room went still. That kind of honesty was rare in a classroom. Vaughn tilted her head. "So you're saying your own military misled the public?" Ethan nodded. "Yes, ma'am. It happened." She raised an eyebrow. "Interesting. And yet you still chose to serve it." A wave of discomfort passed through the room. A few students looked around, unsure if they'd heard her right. The implication was clear, and it wasn't just offensive, it was calculated. Ethan's jaw tightened, but he didn't answer her question. Instead, he said, "I served so people could have the right to speak freely, even when they choose to use it like this." A few students murmured in quiet approval, but Vaughn wasn't done. She turned to the whiteboard and muttered, just loud enough for the room to hear, "Blind loyalty and literature rarely mix." That comment stuck. It wasn't just inappropriate, it was a blatant jab, one that crossed the line between critique and insult. After class, Ethan stayed behind again. Liam caught up to him in the hallway. "She's going too far," he said. "You should file a complaint." Ethan shook his head. "I'm watching. That's enough for now." But watching didn't mean doing nothing. At home, he started keeping track, writing down what she said, when she said it, and who was in the room to witness it. He wasn't looking for revenge. He was preparing, quietly. 2 days later, the class was assigned to work in small groups to analyze different passages of Beloved by Toni Morrison. When it came time to present, Ethan's group had chosen a powerful scene dealing with trauma and memory. Vaughn stopped him midway through the presentation. "I'm going to pause you there," she said, stepping forward. "This interpretation you've offered, it's a little too literal. Trauma is more than just physical wounds. Mr. Carter, some of us have studied it for years. It can't just be reduced to something bad happened. And now, I'm sad." He didn't respond, but everyone in the group stiffened. Vaughn smiled at the class, as if she had just delivered a helpful lecture. "This is why we read literature, to go beyond ourselves, not just insert our personal histories into every paragraph." It wasn't subtle anymore. She was going out of her way to discredit him. And yet, through it all, Ethan kept showing up, sitting in the same seat, submitting his assignments, writing better and stronger with every submission. His next paper, an analysis on silence as a theme in The Things They Carried, was graded with another C despite citations, strong structure, and a clear thesis. "Lacks scholarly depth," she wrote in the margin. He knew better now. It didn't matter how hard he worked. Vaughn had made up her mind. She didn't see a student, she saw a symbol, one she didn't respect. Still, he refused to lose his temper. That wasn't who he was. Instead, he prepared. He started meeting with other professors quietly, asking for feedback on his work. He visited the Student Resource Center, asked them to review the same essays. The feedback was consistent, well-written, focused, thoughtful. It wasn't his writing that was the problem. What was happening in that classroom wasn't about academia. It was about control. But that control was slipping, because soon Ethan wouldn't just prove her wrong, he'd make her regret ever underestimating him. By mid-semester, the classroom tension had transformed into a quiet standoff. Vaughn kept up her performance of authority, and Ethan kept showing up with the kind of discipline that made her increasingly uneasy. He wasn't backing down, but he wasn't playing her game either. It all came to a head during what was supposed to be a simple class debate. The topic, the morality of characters in war literature. Each student was to present a short argument and defend it. When Ethan's name was called, he walked calmly to the front of the class and placed his notepad on the lectern. He took a deep breath and began. "I'd like to talk about the idea that morality in war is rarely black and white. In The Things They Carried, the character Norman Boker struggles to reconcile his sense of responsibility with the horrors he witnessed. That tension between personal morality and survival isn't fiction to some of us." He paused, making eye contact with a few classmates. "I've known people who did the right thing and still couldn't sleep, and I've known others who followed every order and never asked a single question. Literature gives us room to wrestle with that." For once, the class was locked in. You could hear the weight behind his words. This wasn't recitation. This was lived experience filtered through the lens of thoughtful analysis. Then came Vaughn's voice. sharp and clipped. So your position is that morality becomes flexible in war? Ethan nodded. I think it's constantly tested. And sometimes it breaks. Vaughan stepped forward. Interesting. And how do you suggest we, as civilians, verify this moral struggle? Should we simply accept soldiers' stories as truth? You understand, Mr. Carter, that literature isn't a vehicle for self-validation. A hush fell over the room. Everyone knew what she was implying, that Ethan was using his military background to posture, not participate, that his story wasn't academic enough to belong. Ethan stared at her, calm and composed. Professor Vaughan, he said evenly, you assigned this debate. You asked us to analyze morality in war literature using our perspective. She folded her arms. And I expect students to use sources, not sentiment. That did it. He picked up his notepad, took a step forward, and placed it aside. I wasn't going to share this, not because I'm ashamed, but because I didn't think it belonged here, until now. He scanned the room. 2 years ago, I was deployed to a small village in eastern Afghanistan. One night, a roadside bomb killed 2 of my unit's translators, young men, local boys who had helped us build bridges with the community. We knew the attack came from a nearby group, but we also knew retaliating would hurt innocent people. Our commander told us to wait, to do nothing. So we did. He let the silence sit. Later, we learned the group responsible had left the area. But by then, that village, our friends, their families, they were gone too, scared, displaced. We followed orders. We didn't fire a shot. And still, we lost everything. No one moved. Not even Vaughan. That's what war is, he continued. It's not always what you do. Sometimes it's what you don't do. That's what Bowker was wrestling with in the book. And that's why literature like this matters, because it brings those invisible choices to the surface. He turned back to Vaughan. So, to answer your question, no, you shouldn't accept anyone's story blindly, but you also shouldn't dismiss a perspective because it doesn't come wrapped in a footnote. She didn't respond. Not right away. A few seconds later, one of the students, Sophie, started clapping slowly at first. Then others joined in. Not the kind of applause you hear at a pep rally. This was different. This was respect. Vaughan's face stayed neutral, but her posture shifted ever so slightly. Her authority, once unquestioned, had cracked right in front of her class. Ethan walked back to his seat. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply sat down and opened his notebook, like nothing had happened. But something had happened. Everyone in that room knew it. And from that day forward, so did she. The energy in the classroom after the debate was unlike anything Ethan had felt all semester. No one said it out loud, but the shift was visible in people's eyes, in how they looked at him now with a mix of admiration and, for some, a sense of regret that they hadn't spoken up sooner. Professor Vaughan didn't acknowledge what had happened, not the applause, not the pointed silence that followed her final remark. She wrapped up the class with a stiff smile, collected her papers, and left without a word to Ethan. But the damage to her reputation, to her control, had already been done. That evening, Ethan sat in his small apartment, the debate still playing out in his mind. He wasn't the type to feel proud easily, but this was different. This wasn't just about speaking his truth. It was about standing on it without raising his voice, without cursing or storming out. And it worked. But he also knew it wasn't over. Vaughan wasn't the type to admit defeat, at least not publicly. That meant she might try to reassert her power another way. So rather than wait for the next passive-aggressive comment or another C without proper justification, Ethan took the initiative. The next morning, he scheduled a meeting with Dr. Eleanor Hayes, the head of the English department. Dr. Hayes was a sharp, fair woman in her early 60s, known for her measured tone and no-nonsense approach. Ethan brought a folder, copies of his graded papers, printouts of peer-reviewed feedback from the Student Writing Center, and notes he'd been keeping for weeks. He didn't go in angry. He went in ready. I'm not here to get anyone fired, he said plainly. And I'm not asking for special treatment. I just want my work to be judged fairly. And I want to be treated like a student, not a stereotype. Dr. Hayes listened without interrupting. She read through the papers carefully, asked a few follow-up questions, and then leaned back in her chair. Let me be clear, she said. I appreciate the way you've handled this. You could have gone straight to the dean, filed a formal complaint. You didn't. You brought evidence, not emotion. That says a lot. Ethan nodded. I was trained to stay calm under pressure, but I'm not willing to be quiet when I know something's wrong. She looked at him for a long moment, then said, I'll review everything you've submitted, and I'll be sitting in on your next class. Ethan didn't expect that, but he appreciated it. This wasn't about revenge. It was about balance, about making sure the classroom returned to what it was supposed to be, a space to learn, to challenge ideas, not people. That Thursday, Dr. Hayes walked into the lecture hall just minutes before class began. Vaughn stiffened when she saw her, but managed a thin smile. I didn't realize we had a guest, she said lightly. I like to do periodic drop-ins, Hayes replied, keeping it casual. But nothing about that class felt casual. Vaughn was cautious with her words, no sarcastic quips, no dismissive smirks. When Ethan raised his hand, she actually let him finish. The class ended without incident, but the message had been delivered. She knew now people were watching. A week later, Dr. Hayes called Ethan back into her office. I've spoken with Professor Vaughn, she said. I've also reviewed your papers independently, and I've asked another senior faculty member to do the same. You should have been getting B's and A's on most of these. Ethan said nothing, just waited. She's agreed to revise your grades and issue a written acknowledgement of bias in how your work was assessed. It won't go on her permanent record, but it will be kept on file internally. More importantly, you won't be penalized for any of it moving forward. Ethan nodded slowly. It was more than he expected. Dr. Hayes studied him. You handled this with integrity. I'd like to nominate you for the department's annual writing award. There's also a small journalism scholarship you qualify for, if you're interested. He gave the faintest smile. I am. That night, Ethan walked home differently, not faster, not taller, just steady. He hadn't shouted, hadn't threatened, hadn't backed down. He'd simply stood firm. And now, the classroom that had once tried to shrink him had become the first real place where he proved he belonged, not because of what he wore in the past, but because of who he chose to be in the moment. By the time finals week rolled around, the atmosphere in Professor Vaughn's class had changed entirely. There was no announcement, no official apology read aloud, but something had clearly shifted. Vaughn was more cautious, more measured in her tone. She no longer called Ethan Mr. Carter with that edge in her voice. No more side remarks, no more snotty looks when he raised his hand. She had gone silent. For some professors, silence might be a mark of disinterest, but for Vaughn, it was a sign of retreat, a quiet acknowledgement that her grip had slipped, and everyone in the room knew why. Ethan noticed it, but he didn't gloat. He still showed up early, still participated, still held his own during discussions, if anything. Now with more presence, the other students, once passive observers to the quiet war playing out between Ethan and Vaughn, had begun treating him differently too. Not like a hero, not like a victim, just like a peer, the way it should have been from the start. Liam started sitting next to him every class, comparing notes and cracking quiet jokes between lectures. Sophie, the same student who had started clapping during the debate, started asking him for writing feedback. For the first time since the semester began, Ethan felt part of something, not an outsider in a room full of young strangers, but a student among students. A few days before the final exam, he got an email from the financial aid office. He'd been awarded the Howard S. Monroe Journalism Scholarship, small, but enough to cover his next semester's books and a portion of tuition. Attached was a note from Dr. Hayes, your story matters. Keep writing it. He printed that email and folded it into the back of his notebook. Then came the last day of class. Vaughn entered, did her usual routine. She handed out exam booklets, clicked her pen, and gave her final instructions. But before anyone began, she paused. For what it's worth, she said, not looking up. I appreciate the effort many of you have shown this semester. The words hung awkwardly in the air. It was as close to an olive branch as she'd allow herself, not a real apology, but a nod. Ethan didn't need more. He wasn't here for apologies. He had already won, on his terms. After the exam, he waited until most of the students had filed out. Vaughn sat at her desk, organizing papers. He approached slowly. I just wanted to say, I hope the next student like me doesn't have to go through what I did. She looked up at him, And for once, there was no wall behind her eyes, just a flicker of recognition, maybe even guilt. "I'll keep that in mind," she said. He nodded, turned, and walked out of the classroom one last time. Outside, the air was crisp, and the campus buzzed with students heading home for winter break. Ethan sat on a bench beneath a bare maple tree, watching as people laughed, said goodbye, made plans for the holidays. He opened his notebook, flipped past pages filled with red ink, annotations, debate points, and personal reflections. Then he turned to a blank page and wrote 5 words at the top. This is just the start. He didn't know exactly what the future held, whether he'd become a reporter, a columnist, maybe even an author. But he knew this much. His voice was his own, and no one, not a professor, not a grade, not a sideways comment could take that from him. What started as a class about fiction had taught him something real. The strongest rebuttal isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, it's consistent, it's earned. And sometimes, the best way to shut someone down is to rise above them with your dignity intact and keep walking.